All right. Well, first of all, thank you for coming to my session. So a little bit about me. My name is Himica Kumar. I'm a senior product manager at Adyen. It's a payment processing company based here in West Loop, actually, but with our headquarters actually being in Amsterdam. So it is a Dutch company. It's probably one of the largest payments company you've never heard of. It's like, it's yeah, it's something that I can talk about later if you guys are interested. But we're here today to talk about B2B product management. And I've worked at a lot of B2B software companies, Coupa and PayPal as well, prior to my role at Adyen. And so basically my entire career has been in B2B fintech, working with the enterprise, implementing payments and payment solutions and fintech solutions. So that's my background. I really want today's session to be extremely interactive and conversational. So I don't want to stand here for 50 minutes and talk to you. So I really I'm hoping to engage all of you. Maybe if you guys want to move closer, if you're interested. Yeah. Oh, well, that's fine. But yeah, so we're gonna talk, we're gonna work on problems together. And I hope that's okay with you, because otherwise this is right before lunch and people tend to taper off. So let's get started. So first of all, what is B2B product? Let's just start with that. Does anyone want to take a guess, answer, talk about it? Yeah.
You're selling to businesses, not people directly.
True, correct. Big difference. Yeah.
You are building or selling a product. So it could be payments to card or payments to banking.
Right, right. Selling to a company. Yeah.
You have a
A sales
sales force,
group. That's actually a really good point. Yes. Yes, it is also different for B2B. Any other sort of thoughts, inputs? Okay, well, I don't even have a slide on what it is because I just want to talk about it. So I think all of the points you guys covered are extremely important. B2B product management, I would say the biggest difference is that your customer is a company. They are extremely large, in a lot of cases larger than you as a company. And the person choosing to use your product is not the person who ends up using your product day to day. So the decision maker of buying the product software is not the user. So you're actually catering to two types of users. One is the executive who actually makes the decision to buy this product. And then the other is the person who actually is literally paid every day to use this product and make it work for the company. So I think that's a really key differentiator I want to mention. The other thing I think you mentioned is on the sales team part of it. So sales is incredibly important to B2B product. I don't think you can be a good PM in this space if you're not aligned with sales, because a lot of the way B2B product works is you are working with sales to sell something and also build it concurrently. So a lot of these things we're going to talk about happen in parallel. It would be impossible to explain them in that way. So we're just going to talk about it in one cycle, and then we'll kind of talk about how all of these cycles for different products and companies happen at the same time. So to keep this fun, to compare B2B to B2B and B2C product, right? Customers and users. Like I said, B2B, we focus on the client and their users rather than helping solve a personal need of a specific user. We also have different release cycles, right? You can update a B2C product like Instagram, for example, anytime. You're not waiting for your clients. But for B2B, you have to let them know. It's a quite large upgrade that they have to account for. They need documentation on. They may have to do updates. So you can't just release anytime you want. And then the last key difference is the stakeholders. It's a lot more complex in the B2B space because, like I said, you're selling to one person, someone else is using, and a lot of times it's even more complex because you're selling to one VP, let's say, but then there are 5 different users with 5 different modules, and they all want different things. And it's basically you're doing kind of a lot of jobs for this company that you're selling to. So it can be quite complex. So I like to really simplify things. So I've really tried to simplify B2B product into like 6 pieces, I would say 6 components. And I've tried to put them in sort of groups that I think make sense. And this is what I have seen kind of throughout my career. So first is understanding. How do you understand what is a problem? How do you even understand like what should we fix? Understanding what your customers need, what your users want, what your sales team needs versus what the exec wants versus what the market wants. I think that is like the first key important thing. When you get that insight, you kind of ideate like, what can we build? Like, what is something that we can do to help these problems? You have to make sure your ideas actually align with your strategy, right? Like, we're not going to build something that takes us 10 years. Like, that just doesn't work. We're not going to build something that we can't price. We're not going to build something that doesn't align with the company's core strategy or doesn't align with the business use case or just doesn't work for other strategic reasons. Then you have to actually build the thing, right? That can be hard. You need engineers, you need architects, you need UX, docs, like million stakeholders. Then you have to be involved in selling. And I think a lot of PMs don't understand or don't realize how important selling is for product. I think one of the best pieces of advice I was given from my last manager was you have to be the face of your product to everyone, including sales, including marketing, including customer support. Literally everybody in the company, when they think of your product, should think of you. And if you're not that person, then you could be doing better. And I think that was a really interesting piece of advice that I've always tried to live up to. You have to be able to scale your product. So yes, you got 1 customer, but then what about like the other 50 that you need? And then once you get there, you'll understand like, hey, we didn't really build it full. There's now more problems. So let's understand what they are. And let's go back and do this all over again and just continue until you're tired. Yeah. Yes, of course, please.
So I guess, is this, that's kind of like a life cycle. So like if you're thinking of building a product, when do you think about how you're gonna sell the product in terms of like the ideation or understanding? Does it come kind of more towards, you already build it, or does it have to be kind of in the beginning too?
I think it has to be all around. I think when you think of an idea immediately, and I think this will come with practice, is like you think of an idea and then you immediately are like, is this sellable? Like, does sales really want to sell this? And if no, then maybe like go back to your idea. Or can I convince sales to sell this? Or can I convince sales that this is what actually people want and they need to change their tactics? So you have to think about it. You have to think about all of these steps at every step, which is why the whole like arrows could go the other way too, and all across too. Yeah. Yeah.
So are any of these steps different for B2C in terms of?
Honestly, I think not really. Maybe the selling part you do less of, and maybe the scaling part you have less control over because that's more of a marketing function. But I think you could genuinely like extrapolate this to B2B or B2C and it would work. It's more about like the considerations at each of these steps are different. The consumer at the end of these steps is different. And the way you make it happen is different.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, there are more questions. Yeah. Here?
Hey, I had a question. So
Yeah.
basically, when we talk about B2B product management lifecycle, how do you go about defining the product vision? Because you are actually catering to like the C-suite or like the C-level executives. So how do you go about defining the product vision so that it caters to the maximum number of audience?
You keep it very generic. And that's what you'll notice a lot of product strategies are. If you go to Salesforce or Atlassian, right, their product strategy is revolutionizing business spend. Like that could mean anything. It's so extremely generic. But I think at the same time, you need to like, that's like at the very top C-level. And then for every layer below, you'll have a level of strategy that makes sense from the CEO down to the CFO or the CMO or the chief product officer. And then you'll have a level of strategy you have to define that makes sense for the people actually using the products day to day. And then you have a level of strategy for the admin of your product. And so I feel like it's hard to say what the strategy is without knowing who the persona you're talking to is. And it changes slightly. It becomes more generic or more specific. You know, the value prop to a CTO could be better SLAs, but the value prop to the finance team is, hey, we're saving money by doing things this way. So you have to think about it in all ways. And I think to be successful, you have to cover all your bases, which is a lot of work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, like, in your history, like, do you find yourself being like more proactive or more reactive? Like when you, like, do you find yourself developing products on the behalf of the business or internally, and are you finding to be innovative and then offering those products?
I think it's like 75% reactive, if I'm being honest. And I think, like, I'm sure there's lots of PMs here. That's like generally how product is. And then, like, luckily, you know, once a year, maybe I'll get to work on something that I think is innovative, that I've heard from feedback, and then actually make it happen. I think that's like the goal and the dream. But realistically, 75% is like kind of shoved down your throat. So sorry to say it like that. Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to be real. So I do want to go on because I'm going to go into each of these a little bit more detailed. And one thing I want to mention is as we go through these, I'm going to use case studies from some of the companies I've worked with. So Coupa Software, it's actually my last company, sells spend management solutions. And these are 3 customers of Coupa that I thought people might recognize. So I've worked with all 3 of these customers, getting them to implement our payment solution, which is something we sold to the office of the CFO. So I just wanted to like kind of like come down from theory and make this like really practical. So I hope this helps. So let's talk about the first kind of component of that life cycle, which is understanding, like, what is the problem? And how do you really understand what the problem is? Or how do you understand like what things are not going well or what issues exist in the product? Is there a question?
Well, just to provide a little bit more context because of the title of the session, even though you're talking about scaling, you're really focusing on post-product market fit, right? And you're really talking about improving your scalability after you've reached that point of so you have some sort of baseline of understanding.
You have some sort of baseline.
An existing product and solve an existing problem for existing customers. You're not like starting from zero.
Yes, I think that's a really good call out. Thank you. That I probably should have mentioned is we are kind of starting from a place where we have someone interested or at least talking to us, right? And you're starting with some kind of product. You're not going from 0 to 1. I will say that. So good call out. So when you understand the problem, right? Like there are different practical ways I would say that you could think about this, right? Like what is the customer asking for? And how do you know what the customer is asking for? You talk to the account managers, the implementation managers, sales, literally anybody who emails customers, you should talk to them and say, like, what are they asking about? What do they care about? What are they interested in? You can look at market trends. So what are your competitors doing that you can't do? A lot of times for B2B, you can see their API documentation, and through their API docs, you can see what they have built and what they haven't built because it'll clearly say beta or like not live or expected date. That's a really good way to understand what the market's doing. You can look at data insights. Sometimes, you'll have tools like Pendo or LogRocket, I think I saw today. So those tools will also give you a lot of insights into people, users, like what are they doing? Are they starting something and dropping off? Are they not able to find something they need? What's going on? Support cases are really good, I find. Talk to your support team. They have a ton of good insight into what customers are seeing as issues. And then lastly, known gaps. Honestly, if you're new to a product team, if you just talk to the engineers, they'll be like, yeah, we know this doesn't work. We just haven't prioritized it. And it's like, okay, why not? Can we? And they're like, sure, if you want to, you're the PM. So talk to your team, talk to the PMs, talk to everyone who's worked on the team and maybe even left, because you'll find a lot of gaps that way. Yeah.
How do you foster a healthy relationship with the account execs and salespeople? Because I feel like often product people feel
like they're at the mercy of them. And it's just like, I saw
Yeah.
this work, do this thing.
Yeah, I think that's a comment. So I think the question was, how do you not fall at the mercy of account managers and sales reps? And I think the answer is it takes a lot of time to build that trust. I think you can go, I'm very direct, so I just go and say like, hey, I want to help you. I'm not trying to slow things down for you. Can you tell me what's going on so that I can proactively build for them, right? And I think like they kind of, from their perspective, product is always saying no. And I feel like if you can tell them why you're saying no, it helps. I think if you can tell them, yes, I will get to it, but here's why I can't get to it right now. And then you literally explain and you spend 20 minutes telling them what else you're doing. They will have a more empathy for you. So I think it's a lot of just seeking to understand and like be willing to be on a customer call with them because they get a lot of the heat. And I think if you just take some of that heat away and like route it back to yourself, they will feel a little bit better. So a lot of times I've gotten on calls and been like, hey, I'm the PM. And then the account manager is like, yeah, well, the product team won't build what you want. Talk to Himica. And I'm like, thanks for the intro. Let's go, you know? So I think those are things that you can kind of work around. It does take a lot of time though. Okay, so to move on, unless there are more questions, I wanted to actually make this really practical, and depending on time, we may or may not be able to do this. But so really quick context, Coupa does spend management. That means they do procurement, purchase orders, invoicing, and payments to suppliers for everything that a company buys. That's supplier payments, that's like the printer in your printer paper, like chairs, desks, laptops, everything a company buys goes through a company, through a system like Coupa. And Barclays is a customer that uses Coupa to do this. So Barclays, I came across them and they were kind of working on Coupa's virtual card solution. So that is a solution where we pay invoices and POs by card. And basically they said, hey, like, we don't really know, like, we're trying this product, but we don't really want to like go live. We don't really want to give this to more than like 10 internal users. We don't want them to be able to create cards. And the whole thing was we want people in marketing to pay for Google ads and Facebook ads by just like putting a card on there and forgetting about it. That was the entire use case. But they weren't comfortable and they weren't willing to go live without this like list of, 50 Excel rows of minor things they found that were wrong. And I think a lot of times you can come across a customer like this and just get really bogged down by like every Excel row of, hey, when we click on this, it takes too long to load and small things like this, right? But I think the real problem could have been like, to really understand the problem, what we did is we went to like different people at Barclays, because of course this is a project team of like 40 people. And we said, what is really like the problem? Like, why are you taking 6 months? Why can't you do testing? Why are you not like using our product, even though, like at this point, they've already bought our product. They're not using it and they're wasting their money. So we're really confused. And so I think as an example, like when we talked to their finance team, they said, hey, like, I don't know if you realize, but in the UK, which is where Barclays is located, we need to be able to get tax back. So every time we spend money, we need to be able to reclaim VAT. And that's something that they weren't getting because they were paying by card. And they said, hey, paying by card is really easy and clean and, helps us. We get rebates. But then I don't get my tax reclaim. And that's why like we're not comfortable going with more than 10 users. And this is like, well, sales didn't catch it. Like no one caught this. So what do we do now? And like that's why they pulled in products. So this is kind of just setting the context of what I came across. This is a true life example, I will say. So I hope it makes sense. If not, please ask questions. Okay.
I can confirm that this is very common in banking.
Yes. Yes.
We have so many products that we bought, millions of dollars we never used.
Yes. Yes. I think.
Just because Chris didn't catch it or legal didn't catch it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a
No,
question.
I wanted to support your point because in many industries, you only have one shot.
Yeah.
If you screw it up at phase 2 here, it's going to be very hard to recover. So that part is really important.
Yeah. And I think it's really important as a PM to like get in there, like get yourself in front of the customer, because a lot of times just even getting to that point can be hard. There could be a lot of people who say no or let us handle it. Just ignore all that and go get in front of the customer, even if they're huge, even if the call is at 4 a.m. your time because they're in London, just do it. So moving on to the next component, I want to talk about ideation, and then we'll come back to this component and how we ideated to solve for Barclays. I think for me, ideas are really interesting. That you can come across them at any point, but it always just helps like to have like a good old-fashioned meeting where everyone's just like throwing out their ideas. I think that's like sometimes just exactly what you need. But other ways you can do this is to watch the customer. Like, how are they using your product? What are they like struggling with? You know, if you watch your customer use your product, you can really see like what their pain points are. You can do usability testing if you have that available to you. That's not always available. You can have customer advisory boards. This is also pretty common, I think, in the B2B world, where you like literally get like 20 customers together in a room and then you talk about what do you think we should be doing. And a lot of times that will lead to innovation. Like, they will tell you what they want. They will say, hey, I used to work at X company. This is how we did it there, but we can't do it here with your product because of this reason. So I think a lot of innovation is already there in the environment you're in. It's just finding it and getting people to talk, because I think a lot of people sometimes don't want to talk. Like, when you come as a PM, they think you know everything, so they don't want to raise their ideas. So I think that's important too. And then just like non-creepy ways of watching them, like use the product. I think that's also very helpful. So pause, questions. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
For the advisory board,
I guess, who do you invite there? Or like, I guess, in terms of if you're thinking of the buyer and the end users, like if you're thinking of the problem, I guess what are you usually seeing, you know?
I try to focus on the people who use the product daily, not the executives who are making the decision. And I think that's important because they want to attend because it's like,
Yeah.
a free
Yeah.
ticket to something, you know, but you want the daily users. You don't want the people who don't actually use the product day in and day out. Yeah.
But how do you get those in the room? Because sometimes I find that that account person for that company.
I directly email them because I know they're using the product. I have their login, which is usually their company email, and then I email them.
Okay.
Which
Thank you.
works. Yeah.
A couple of things like I've done also is you entice them by telling them that they get to spend time with their peers who are in the
Yes.
same job role that often they don't get to do.
Yes.
Because for them, to be honest, a lot of times they're less interested in hearing from me as a product manager, but they're more interested in hearing from their peers that
Yes.
work at all the other companies. So that's a big incentive. One other comment is when I've done advisory boards, it depends on what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to really improve the product, yes, get the users. But I've also done advisory boards that are strictly focused on market trends. So I've brought the executives together to try to really understand where the market is going as well.
Yeah. I think that's really a key point, is like they want to meet each other too, because then they get ideas. So I think there's one more question.
Yeah, I was trying to think through in the B2B dynamic, the user as an employee versus a user as a consumer of the business. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if you're doing like Salesforce. Oh, thank you. Like Salesforce, you know, the users are usually employees of another company versus like PayPal, right? So for observing users of companies who are the like consuming your product, but then selling to consumers, how do you work with product in the business on your buyer? Because there's like another product group in that org who has direct access to the users. So how do you work with them to get their users? Do you see what I'm saying?
I typically ask them, but I think it's just a communication thing, right? It's like, so it depends on your product and it depends on the company, but you just have to go to them and say, this is what we want. And it's like, the idea is to help you. And sometimes you can incentivize it like, hey, you do this for me, I'll like solve a bug ticket for you that you've had open for 10 years, you know? And they'll usually say yes if you incentivize them. So I think you can be a little creative on getting to the right people. So for sure. Yeah.
Back to the advisory board, them not just coming in and like bashing things that they don't
Having-
like together.
yeah.
About bringing in our customers like together like that. We talked about it, but like I'm so.
I think, yeah. So the question is, how do you prevent your customers from coming in and kind of just like bashing the product and just like complaining for the whole time? And I think it's a very valid question. But I would say that kind of setting the agenda up front, saying we want to give you an insight into our roadmap that you haven't seen, and you only get to see it if you come here. So you kind of set the stage that this is for future planning. We know you have issues, and we'll sit down with you after this advisory board and talk about them. And that's another thing you offer them. But like this 1 hour or 2 hour session is really dedicated for just that. And everything else, we'll have your account manager, we'll talk about it, like we'll make it happen for you. So it's about separating those. Coupa actually did a really good job of this. We used to have advisory boards 2 or 3 times a year in different cities. So we would actually get people in person. So we do one in Europe, one in Australia, and one in the US. So that was really nice. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a suggestion, we actually invited a company I was at, we invited the squeaky wheels, the people who complained. And no one wants to hear like the button should be blue, because the people that are there want to see like bigger things in the tool. And so that actually, we had the opposite experience. People didn't come in and just bash the product. But an exercise you can do in an advisory advisory panel is if you have things like the little stuff that they want versus the big stuff, you could go through an exercise, list it all out, explain what it is, and have people put money towards it, right? Everyone gets $500 and you can place it, and it becomes very obvious, like the bigger thinkers, the people who aren't squeaky wheels, who aren't just a bash, it'll become very obvious that that person who's the squeaky wheel needs to get on board. Because the point of the panel is to direct the vision or the next steps of the product versus the button's not blue and it's in the wrong spot, which we all get. I totally get that.
Yeah, I think that's also a really good point. I think just being in person and hearing everyone else, it takes them out of the headspace they're in and like into a broader, it just helps generally. I think also in person really helps too, if you can do that. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to a diagram I found from Appendo State of Product Leadership Report. So if you look at this, B2B, most ideas directly come from customer feedback. That's almost 40%. And then the remaining 27% is from product teams. So I think you can see very clearly that like internal suggestions are very low, but like number 2 on B2C. And that's because in the B2B world, everything is coming from the customer. So if you're not like in their face, if you're not talking to them regularly, it's going to be very hard for you to build the right things. And a lot of times by talking to them, you understand how to take your product to the next level, how to scale it from just being a little payment versus like something the entire office or like other people could use. So I think scaling also comes from talking to customers. So going back to our practical example of Barclays, remember we talked about how they don't want to use our product because they don't think they can reclaim tax. But it's, you know, from their AP point of view, hey, paying by cards is great. Everything's streamlined. I don't have to deal with an invoice. Things are approved on time, but we're not getting reclaimed. So one side of their CFO office is happy. The other side is saying we can't reclaim tax. So we don't really want to expand this past like 5 people or 10 people. So I think once I figured out that was the problem, the way we kind of ideated on that was to say, okay, so the problem is you need data for tax reclaim. That doesn't mean you can't pay by card, right? Like, can we get you that data through another way? So one idea was, can we get that through the card networks itself? So I don't know if you guys know this, but card networks send a lot of data when you issue cards and process cards. And sometimes there's something called L2 and L3 data, which includes what the tax percentage was in the tax code. And in European countries, it gives you all that detail. We thought that was a great idea. So that was the first idea. We talked to our partners, we talked to MasterCard, and MasterCard goes, well, you're only going to get it like 40% of the time. And even when you do get it 40% of the time, a lot of times people are just going to punch in 0 because they don't really care. And by sending L2, L3 data, they get some kind of benefit. So it's just like bad data. So that kind of killed the whole plan of going to getting the data another way. So then we said, okay, we know that if people are spending on card, there's likely a receipt somewhere, right? Like they get a receipt. How can we get that information on the receipt? It's also on the receipt, and receipts are legally required in like pretty much all countries. So how can we do that? And then it was like, oh, like what if we just take a photo and like extract all the data and automatically type it in and all of that stuff, like image recognition. That was a great idea. And then we're like, well, that's probably going to take 5 years to build. So great idea, but maybe too far ahead. Another idea we came up with was, well, this kind of is annoying, but users can actually type it in and we can like predict it for them. We could do like poor image matching and predict it for them like 80% of the time and then have them correct it. And this way, we don't keep Barclays waiting for like another few years, but we give them something in like 3 months that they can use now. And no one seemed to oppose that idea because it seemed reasonable enough. And actually, that's the idea that we ended up going with, but I'll talk about why more later. Questions, comments? I feel like people are like really feeling or like empathizing with this problem. So that's good to know. So next, we have strategizing. Like we've come up with these ideas, and I kind of already did this, but does this make sense? Like, does your idea make sense? Does it like match up with what people want? Does it align with your business strategy? Does it align with what your stakeholders want? Like, is it even possible, like technically to build this? Like, do we have the technology, or would we have to acquire a company or partner with a new company to build it? Like, all of those things are considerations you have to think about, because you could have the best idea, which we did, but then realize it's impractical. And in the time it would take to build it, we would lose the customer. So I think strategizing is talking about how can we make this idea commercially successful? How can we build it so, of course, it supports our one customer, Barclays, but it also supports a myriad of other customers, right? Customers who are not even asking for this yet because they're too small or they're not quite as large as Barclays, but they're getting to that point and they will need this in the future. And kind of, you know, again, customer validation, we could just directly go back to Barclays and be like, hey, does this work? Other customers, like, would this work? Would you do this? Could you see yourself doing this in Europe? Again, focus group and advisory boards again, because not only do you ideate with them, you also validate your ideas with them. Competitor analysis, like, hey, you know, what is Coupa's competitor SAP doing about this? Like Ariba, what do they do? Do they even handle it? By doing this, are we differentiating ourselves? And if so, that becomes even another leverage point, because now we can sell it. We can think about monetizing it more because our competitors don't do it. Strategic alignment, does this make sense with what our company wants to do? I think a lot of you may have heard, you know, ChatGPT recently. So a lot of companies are out there thinking, how can we use AI, right? So if that is like something strategically your company wants to do, is that something, is this an area where we can like tie those two things together? And lastly, the business case, like, does this make sense from a business standpoint of something we want to build and maintain? And, you know, among the myriad of other things that we need to build as a company, does it make sense to even prioritize this right now? So you have to always ask your question, like, does it make sense to do this and right now? So those are just kind of some of the thoughts behind strategizing. Any questions? No? Okay, cool. So again, for Barclays, these are kind of some of the things we thought about. We took this example, we talked to Barclays. We also talked to Aon, which is a pretty big international company. So they had some thoughts on what they would do. We talked to a few other customers and we realized, while it's not like they weren't super excited about it, they said it would unblock them enough for them to move forward. And especially Barclays, they said, hey, this would move us forward for another 2 years. So for me, that was like, this is still a win, because you can't ever get to your ideal state. You kind of have to incrementally build. So that was one way we kind of made sure this was successful. This could be successful. We talked to our sales team to see what they were feeling about this. If they were talking to people in Europe, what do they think? Like, if they started pitching this in their sales deck, did that work? Or did it get questions? Or did it get laughed at? Like, what was the feedback? So I think those are some ways that we were able to kind of validate this would be successful before we started actually building, like putting in all our resources to build it. Questions? Okay. So moving on to actually building something, I'm sure you guys have heard of minimum viable product, MVP. I kind of like this new term, minimum lovable product, because you don't want to build something so crappy that no one wants to use it, you know? You want to build something that people like to use. So I would say maybe go a little bit like 10% extra to make your MVP a lovable product, something people actually want to use, something that excites them, something that's like, oh, this is really cool. I think that goes a long way. And, you know, I think this is something we've all heard before, but, you know, you align your stakeholders, you get your input from your UX, your dev teams, your architects, you write a PRD, you make sure the PRD is clear, you work with engineers to make sure it makes sense, you kind of get a timeline, and then you build your code, you develop, you test, and as a PM, you should also be testing. I can't say this enough, there are so many times I found like things that no one would, like the spell, like if you have an engineer in Europe, they might spell finalize with an S instead of a Z, and it's like, okay, but this product's being sold in the US, so we have to update the spelling. So like, just test. Don't be afraid to get in there, get your hands dirty, report these things, release and iterate. You don't have to do this all at once, right? You should be always releasing in components that are releasable. You don't have to do a major release. You could keep doing lots of minor releases, and that way you're building something that is sellable and testable and agile, actually. Thoughts? Yeah.
Do you have any frameworks that you use for stakeholder alignment that usually work for you? For us,
like internal stakeholders? Like
yeah, like internal stakeholders. Like our services side does not ever want to push our MLPs and VPs because they're just like, no, we don't, it's not like fully functional, or it's not like perfect yet. So we don't want to tell our customers about it that we're working on it. And it's just, I don't really know how to get past that.
I think that's something at a company level that maybe needs to be discussed, or just working with individual like customer facing folks like, hey, I know this isn't perfect yet, but otherwise you will likely lose the customer. So what's better? You know, kind of just pushing them to say, this is still better than what they have. And honestly, if you can directly talk to the customer, then maybe you can convince them. Yeah.
I think another framing for it, and I think one of the reasons to not go into lovable is that making it lovable, I think, implies a greater certainty that this is the right product or this is the right feature, and you don't know. And so the faster you get real feedback in terms of real usage, the more that you're validating that. And so, you know, maybe another model is that you're releasing an MVP in some sort of way, being prepared to then very quickly make it lovable if people say, oh yes, this is solving like a really painful thing for me, but accept that it's kind of a pain in the ass. But if nobody cares, then you don't bother making it lovable. And I think the lovability thing is basically like icing on a mediocre cake 95% of the time. And that's what designers never want to hear, is that like, it's really more about are you really solving a serious pain point? And if you're not, the lovability layer doesn't actually change the outcome. You know, it's so.
Yeah, I just, the only thing I'll say is I've seen really bad really bad products in the name of MVP that like just aren't usable. So it's like, this defeats the entire point, right? So like, build something that's good enough, but not amazing, but also good enough that people aren't like upset about using it. That's all I would say. Yeah. Yeah, another question?
Yeah, I was actually kind of want to go off that.
Yeah.
Something that's really valuable is like that kind of like Pareto effect, like 80-20.
Yeah.
Like 20% of your products may make up 80% of your business.
Right.
So I was curious, like with that, obviously people, I think a lot of times in product or design, build things they're super passionate about, but it doesn't mean anything. They're building things that are going to sit on the shelf that no one's actually going to use regardless of how cool it is or lovable.
Yeah.
So at what point in this life cycle here have you found yourself in the past stopping development because regardless of how cool it is, it's not going to produce a ton of business?
if there are customers who just don't care. You know, like if there's a customer who says, this is cool, but it's not going to change my decision, then it's not worth building, because there are things that will change their decision to go with you versus a competitor, right? So it's like, I think you're absolutely right. Like a lot of things we build don't get used, and that's okay. And if you see that happening, you should just scrap this and go focus on the things that are being used. But sometimes it's like, I still think sometimes there are those 20% of items that you build and slowly get adopted because people aren't used to them. So it's like finding a balance, but you're right. You should spend 80% of your time on the things that 80% are used more. So yeah.
I found too that focusing on sales helps a lot. So if I've built products where when then you get to sales training and sales says, okay, I understand this, I can't sell it. I don't know how we're going to close a deal. I can't articulate a clear value proposition. I can't put this in terms. That's when the big red flags come up, as well as this might be a nice to have and not a need to have. So I found that getting input from the sales team can help a lot.
Yeah, you should definitely get input from sales before you build something. I feel like is definitely like a helpful metric to guide your building. So if sales says don't build this, that's like a very clear sign, you know, that you shouldn't build it. Yeah. Okay. So just kind of moving on. I know we don't have that much time left. For Barclays example, we built this, but one thing we wanted to keep in mind is that they're in Europe. So like, this is like a small practical example, right? They're in Europe. So we definitely wanted to make sure we released in Europe first. And a lot of times products can differ region to region. So those are things to keep in mind, right? Also, just making sure that what we were building, of course, to help them, but other customers. And it was something that we didn't build this until we had agreement, like written agreement, that they would use this in 6 months when it was released. And that way we made sure that our resource use was going to have some end result and like it would be fruitful. So those are some of the things, you know, to watch out for when building a product. I would also say make sure that you have the resources, right? Like obviously we didn't commit to Barclays until we knew internally we could get our engineering resources to do this. And so it was all kind of happening at once, but just a practical thing. Moving on to selling, I think PMs should be involved in selling to some extent. That actually means a lot of things. That means documentation. That means that when you have a customer who's interested, they can read your API docs or understand what is actually going to be, like, how does the product work? So good documentation is also something we should think about. Marketing, so working with marketing, like what is the go-to-market? What are the use cases that we want to target? How can we maybe create a webinar to introduce this and have a lot of people talk about it? Partnerships, a lot of times companies have partnerships with consulting firms or just generally a lot of partnerships with other companies that you could leverage to make sure they are aware. And then when partners are aware, they can also bring customers to you. Pricing is really important. I think if you're building something that took a lot of effort and you think you can price it, you should talk to your pricing team and say, hey, we want to start charging, $5 for every time we use this feature, or we want to, increase our ACV, our annual fee for our product, because we now have this really cool feature that our competitors don't. So be thinking about those and definitely be talking to those teams. And the last thing I'll say is customer communications. There's a lot of external docs that go out through documentation. Sometimes your execs send out a newsletter, conferences, like public marketing events. Make sure you get your feature out there in front of those customers so that you can get even more feedback. So again, quickly just doing this for Barclays. We at Coupa used to have a yearly conference in Vegas. We talked about it everywhere. We had our partners talk about it. We released it. I personally wrote an email and I sent it to all the customers I had spoken to, and everyone seemed to be okay with it. No one stopped me. So, just go out there, talk about it. You are your own products market, first person to market for your own product. Thoughts, questions? Okay. And then sales. I just wanted to throw this in there. Sales will sell things that don't exist. Just a call out. I hope no one here is a salesperson. If you are, it's okay. Um, and then the last thing is actually scaling this. So like once you've built something, that's not the end. How can you make it 10x bigger? How can you increase to different regions or customers or use cases? Like how can we make this work for the UK and Europe and Australia and Canada? Like how can you just expand? So, you know, things to watch out for our KPIs, like where are people using it? What parts are people using? What are they not using? Again, supporting sales, you know, go to the sales team in a different region and say, this had success in Europe. Can we do this in the US? A lot of internal trainings I find are helpful. So if you have an opportunity internally to present to other product teams, sales, solutions consulting, I mean, professional service, you name it, like whoever you can talk to, just talk to. Help implementations. If you have an actively, like a customer you've signed and is implementing, go and help them and introduce them to these new features. Because a lot of times I find that folks in implementation are so busy and heads down that they don't realize a lot of new functionality has come out. So definitely talk to them. And then again, customer feedback. I feel like that's been on every slide. Just get their feedback. So it's obvious. And again, for Barclays, right, we made sure that what we built worked in Europe, worked for other countries. We built it in such a way that, you know, that future feature where we could actually do the image scan and OCI recognition, we built it in such a way that that would be easier when we were able to bring that in. So that was a technical thing we did. It's not obvious to customers at all, but we built it in a technical way that would make that easy. And then lastly, what I'll say is, we had some success. So these are real life examples again from Coupa. You can see kind of like these have all become references for Coupa. These are reference customers, they're public. They talk about Coupa, I hope. And they really like were key successful customers. So I think this is kind of the end goal because once you've achieved this as a B2B PM, you can like use it to sell to other customers. And this becomes very helpful for a new customer coming in. And then if you're too successful, you'll just have to learn how to say no. This was supposed to be a funny thing. That's all I have. So any questions, any last comments? Don't want to hold you back from lunch. Yeah.
Well, if it's lunchtime,
No, it's okay.
For scaling, do you have suggestions? You'd mentioned, you know, leveraging that you're in a different country, but scaling like outside of your organization, maybe resources you don't have, maybe leveraging partnerships or other ideas to scale that maybe isn't already a structure in place that you have to find yourself?
For that kind of thing, it's helpful if you can find an exec or a VP who's willing to do that with you, and then they can tell you, hey, we've, you know, a lot of times they're involved in conversations you're not, so they can say like, we've been talking to this partner, we just like didn't explore it for XYZ reason, but if you think this is helpful, I can get you in front of them. So I think it's just like that to me is like internally bubbling it up to higher and higher levels, and at their level, they're much more easily able to like scale in that way or find strategies to scale in that way. Anything else? That's all. Thank you guys so much. Thank you.